All right, let's get started. I'm joined in the studio by the Director of Popular Conservatism, Mark Littlewood. Mark, what did you make of Kemi's victory?
Well, I actually voted for Robert, but it was a difficult choice. I thought that the MPs whittled it down to two superb candidates. Keir Starmer's not going to know what's hit him over the dispatch box next week. We saw a brilliant Rishi Sunak in his budget response, a sort of demob happy Rishi Sunak.
He was fantastic.
It's amazing, isn't it? When you unburden politicians of office, suddenly they perform twice as well. She's going to be really punchy at the dispatch box. She's got an immediate task to bring the party together, but I don't think that will be particularly difficult, actually. There were differences of emphasis between herself and Robert Jenrick. Robert Jenrick was much more specific on policy. She had more of the vision thing, which she's going to have to slowly fill out with policy. But she's got to bring the party together. That's the first key step. Shouldn't be awkward. She's got to sock it to the Labour Party. Then she's got to develop quite a programme for government, because despite the thrashing on July the 4th, the shellacking that the Conservative Party received, there is every chance that they could be back in government in one go, and that means a thoroughly worked-out policy programme. Not today, not tomorrow, not even this year, but over the next 18 months. And then the big elephant in the room is what you do about reform and Farage. Can you win back a good chunk of the vote who disappeared in that direction? So quite an agenda for her to get her teeth into. But if she can pull that off, she's not just the new leader of the Conservative Party, she's probably the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
Well, the polls are suggesting that the Conservative Party are ahead as well, ahead of Labour already. And this was even before we knew who was leading the party. So that suggests that either or, people would still...
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, the poll, it shows how far we in the Conservative Party have fallen, where we're punching the air that we're 1% ahead and on 29% of the vote. But Labour's honeymoon period was just hours or days. And usually when a government gets into trouble, I'm not saying there's no coming back, but it tends to be you just keep sliding. So the Conservatives can be pretty optimistic going forward. And as I say, after the thrashing in the July election, you would have thought it would have been months of Labour Party politicians walking around on cloud nine, whilst Conservatives were in clouds of despair. But I think Kemi's victory, the nature of the campaign, means that Tories can see a way back to power in one attempt. Not easy, cannot be taken for granted, high mountain to climb. But if we actually start to unravel the leftism that has racked Britain for the last quarter of a century, frankly, some of it under the last Conservative administration, then I think this can be won back. So big challenge, but huge opportunity for Kemi.
But if the Labour Party carry on with this attack on farmers, attack on pensioners, attack on working person, however they want to define it, I mean, that was a nonsensical farce. If they carry on, I think the Conservatives could literally... Do you think they could play the same tactic that Keir Starmer did, just sit back and let them just slide themselves out of power?
Well, they could, but I rather hope they don't, Nana, because... Keir Starmer just stood to one side, issued various statements of word salad, hoped that the incumbent government would become so unpopular that he'd sort of just come into power on a negative vote. Then turns out you haven't really worked out what to do. The Labour Party's prescription just seems to be that the Tories didn't tax enough, spend enough, borrow enough or regulate enough. Now, I'd actually say I think the Conservatives did rather too much of all of those things, but they're doubling down on what I think the Conservatives got wrong in the last administration. I really think that the Conservatives have got to think through, under Kemi's new leadership, a real positive agenda for what would change. So, sure, in the coming weeks and the coming months, it's mainly holding the government to account. Kemi actually just said that in her speech. You've got to be the case for the opposition against the government. But as time rolls on, I'd like to see a pretty clear policy agenda. And I think there's an awful lot in Britain that needs to be completely reset. We're governed by quangos and bureaucracy. We're taxed to death. And I actually think a pretty radical agenda is probably the one to win, rather than a play it safe and hope Labour implodes.
Well, if they stick to being Conservative, then they've got every chance of winning. What are your views on the farmers and the attack on inheritance tax?
Yeah, it's extraordinary, really. I mean, what seems to be particularly pernicious about it is Labour are giving the impression that they have identified each and every cohort of voters who don't vote Labour, be this pensioners or people who send their kids to private school or farmers, and the tax burdens being shuffled onto them. And what's particularly worrying about this is a good number of farms are on the verge of viability, right? And if you impose this inheritance tax and you have to basically sell off 20% of what you inherit because you haven't got the liquid assets to pay the bill, you become even less viable. So it's not just a higher tax that all people complain about. It's potentially an existential tax for British farming. And I'm afraid I'm expecting to see more and more of the sort of policy we saw in Rachel Reid's budget as we go on. They are going to try and hoover up yet more cash from the private sector to pay out for the relatively unproductive public sector, where their political allies are, where their client vote is. And in consequence, the overall economic pie, the size of the economy, will be a lot smaller than it should otherwise be.
And I notice a lot of the constituencies where these farms are on are Tory constituencies, aren't they? Yeah. What a surprise. Mark Littlewood, thank you very much.